Good morning and welcome to the 7th session in the Children's Mental Health Learning Series. As you may be aware, the development of this series and the information provided has been in response to the request from Human Services staff. The information presented is intended to assist staff in supporting children and families that they serve. The wide variety of topics in these sessions may be beneficial also to parents and guardians. Educators and healthcare personnel may find this information helpful in their own roles supporting children and families. Some of you may be familiar with the Government of Alberta Social Policy Framework. It is a living document that provides decision-making tools to assist the growing and diverse needs of Albertans and to address social challenges. The framework is part of an ongoing dialogue between individuals, agencies, community organizations, and the non-for-profit sector to ensure that Albertans who require help will have access to the supports they need. In alignment with the social policy framework, the Ministry of Human Services has integrated the disability programs under a single regional service delivery system. The integration of the family support for children with disability and the persons with developmental disability programs will streamline the disability support system into one support program that will provide supports to children, youth, adults, and their families across the lifespan. This will ensure that services and supports are based on assessed needs of both the children, the youth, the adults, and their support families, and will assist them and their adult family members to reach the full potential they so fully deserve. As we consider Dr. McConnell's work and presentation today, we are reminded that every parent must have the opportunity to create a healthy and meaningful life for their children. Now, by way of introduction for Dr. David McConnell, David McConnell is a professor and director of Family and Disability Studies Initiative at the Faculty of Rehabilitation Medicine, University of Alberta. David has been conducting research in the field of parents and parenting with intellectual disabilities for over 20 years. In Australia, his research culminated in a world-first national study to build systems capacity to support parents with intellectual disabilities and their children. David is currently the elected chair of the International Association of Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, Special Interest Research Group on Parenting and Intellectual Disabilities. So today, give us a warm welcome or a nice Calgary welcome to David. And so with any further ado, please, David, take the stand.
So I want to start today by looking back at two what I'd call game-changing natural experiments conducted around about the time of the Second World War. The two natural experiments were radical at the time, and the results were surprising. They challenged many taken for granted assumptions about the nature of human development and really served to usher in a new era in developmental science. Today, I think the results of these two experiments still have the power to surprise, only for entirely different reasons. In the second part of my presentation, I want to talk about or reflect on the complex interrelationship between socioeconomic disadvantage, social relationship, intelligence, and parenting capacity. And the context for that discussion is the tremendous variability we observe in the performance of parents with intellectual disability. The question really is, why is it that some parents succeed where others struggle? I don't for a minute think that there's a simple answer to that question. I don't for a minute think that I have the answer to that question. But I do think that it has more to do with who rather than what parents know. It's who you know, not what you know, as they say. That actually would have been a nice subtitle for this presentation. In the final part of the presentation, should there be time, I want to talk about a program we call the Supported Learning Program, which is designed to help strengthen the social relationships of mothers with intellectual disability. And our preliminary research suggests that this program has real potential. Now, looking back, So back in the 1930s, Howard Scales, a young psychologist working for the Iowa State Board of Control of Institutions, noticed that two little girls, both under 18 months of age at the time, showed marked signs of mental deficiency. Formal testing and clinical observations resulted in a diagnosis of mental deficiency of imbecile level. The two girls were then transferred to a state institution for the feeble-minded. The transfer note read, diagnosis of mental ability, mental deficiency of imbecile level, which will probably continue with an increase in age. Prognosis, poor. With a deficiency in mental development, this child will be unable to make her way outside the care and protection offered by an institution for feeble-minded children. 6 months after their transfer, Howard was visiting the institution when he was surprised by the apparent remarkable development of these two little girls. The two girls were re-examined and obtained IQ scores of 77 and 87. They were assessed again 12 months later and again when they were 3.5 years of age, and on both occasions the results showed normal intelligence. The two girls were soon adopted. The surprising development of those two little girls led to a rather fantastic proposal. Transfer young mentally retarded children from the orphanage nursery to the institution for the feeble-minded in order to make them normal. Subsequently, a total of 13 young children, all under the age of 3, were transferred to the institution. And the development of these 13 children and the development of a contrast group of 12 children who remained in the institution was examined periodically over the next 3 years. At the time of transfer, the mean IQ of the 13 children transferred to the institution was 64.3. At the end of the experimental period, the mean IQ was 91.8. The average gain in IQ was 27.5 points. And positive changes were also observed in social, emotional, and behavioural development. By contrast, the mean IQ of the 12 children in the contrast group, that is the kids who remained in the orphanage, was 86.7 on first examination and 60.5 at the end of the experimental period. The average loss was 26.2 points. All but one of these children were now classified as feeble-minded. The question for Howard was, how could these stunning findings be explained? He reasoned that apart from intelligence, where the contrast group had a distinct advantage at the outset, the two groups were well matched to begin with. The children were similar in terms of age, birth history, medical history, and family backgrounds. So the results of the study were unlikely to be due to pre-existing group differences. With regard to social history, Howard writes, social histories revealed the children of both experimental and contrast groups came from homes of low social, economic, occupational, and intellectual levels. In fact, almost all the children in both groups had been taken from feeble-minded mothers to be made state wards. The practice of separating children from mothers with intellectual disability was common then, and it remains common today. On any given night, in high-income countries around the world, around 1 in 5 children residing in out-of-home care were taken from mothers with mostly mild intellectual disability or cognitive impairment. Our work in Australia and then in England and more recently here in Canada shows that there are a number of contributing factors. One contributing factor is the clustering of risk factors in the lives of people with intellectual disability. Another factor is systemic discrimination. All too often the decision to separate a child from his or her mother with intellectual disability is made on the basis of flawed assumptions. There's the assumption that the deficits, any perceived parenting deficits, must be caused by the intellectual disability. This is the phenomenon of diagnostic overshadowing. And then also known as the fundamental attribution error, where we tend to attribute other people's behaviours to traits or something about them as opposed to something in their environment. Another assumption is that of irremediable deficiency. You see, what happens is parenting deficits and intellectual disability are conflated. And since we cannot remedy intellectual disability, the assumption is that we can't remedy the parenting deficits either. There's a couple of graphs here taken from our study of the Canadian incident study of reported child abuse and neglect. And figure 1 there shows that mothers with intellectual disability were much more likely than mothers without to have been maltreated in their own upbringing, to have had mental health issues, to be using drugs or alcohol, and to have few social supports. What figure 2 there shows is that even when we take all those factors into account, children of mothers with intellectual disability are today still far more likely to be placed out of home than children of parents without intellectual disability. That was my brief aside. So back to Howard's early observations. So the question for Howard is how did the children's experiences differ? Well, after transfer, the 13 children in the experimental group were placed on wards with older girls. Truthfully, they were women between the ages of 18 and 50. And no more than 1 or 2 children were placed on a ward at any one time. Howard observed that the older girls became very fond of the children. They would play with them, teach them, make them clothes. In fact, most of the clothes the children wore were made by those older girls. The older girls would even use their own small earnings and allowances to buy stuff, toys, material to make clothing with for those children. Further, Howard observed that in the case of almost every child, some one adult, that is one of the older girls on the ward, would become particularly attached to a given child and would figuratively adopt him. As a consequence, there would develop an intense adult-child relationship with the other girls on the ward playing the part of adoring aunties. This meant that each child had some one person with whom he was identified and who was particularly interested in him and his achievements. By sharp contrast, the children in the contrast group lacked relationship. They lacked a relationship with an affectionate, responsive adult. The conditions in which where they were cared for, they certainly received excellent physical and medical care in a sanitary environment, and in an environment that was not too stimulating, because in the mid-1930s it was thought that stimulating a child was not really a very good idea. So these children basically received what was thought to be best care at that time. But what was lacking was that relationship. The story did not end there. 2.5 years later, Howard did a follow-up. All of the children were re-examined. By that time, 11 of the 13 children in the experimental group had been adopted. The mean IQ of these 13 children at follow-up was 95.9. 3 of the children demonstrated superior intelligence. Remember, these were children who were admitted to the institution on the grounds that their mental deficiency made them ineligible for adoption. Now, there is something of an irony here, don't you think? First, these children were taken from their feeble-minded mothers who were apparently unfit to care for them. Then they were placed in the care of feeble-minded women. I use the word feeble-minded here because that's the language of the day, to be made normal. The children were figuratively adopted by one or other of these feeble-minded women, and they thrived in their care. In fact, because they thrived, they were then taken from their feeble-minded surrogate mums to be formally adopted by respectable, middle-class, mostly, parents. Howard actually did a 20-year follow-up. They were interested in finding the answer to a few simple questions like, what happened to the two groups of children when they became adults? Were the two divergent pathways maintained, or did they converge over the years? With some difficulty, they managed to track down all the now adult children, except for one. One child in the contrast group had died in the institution. The 13 now adult children from the experimental group had completed on average 12 years of formal education. Most were working in occupations such as nursing or teaching, or were operating small businesses. 11 of the 13 had married. They had 28 children altogether. These 28 children had a mean IQ of 104. The surviving and now adult children in the contrast group had not fared as well. 4 of them had remained in the institution. On average, they had just 4 years of formal school education. Dishwasher was the most common listed occupation among those who had any work history at all. 2 of the 11 had married, 1 had a child, and that child was thought to be feeble-minded. I want to move on to talk a little about the second study now. I want to talk about the early observations of Renee Spitz. This may be a study you're quite familiar with. In some ways, it paved the way for deinstitutionalisation. Not long after the Second World War, Dr. Renee Spitz initiated a prospective study of environmental influence on infant development. They looked at the effects of 4 different conditions on a total of 164 children. The first 2 conditions function mainly as reference points. In one group, there were children raised in progressive middle-class family homes in a large city. In another group, there were children raised in family homes in an isolated fishing village. The main focus, though, was on the effects of 2 different institutional settings. One group comprised children raised for the most part by their mothers in an institution for delinquent girls. Spitz observes that the background of these children provides for markedly negative selection, since the mothers are mostly delinquent minors as a result of social maladjustment and feeble-mindedness. Later he explains that these girls become delinquent because they've not been able to sublimate their sexual drives. The fourth group comprised children in a foundling home, an orphanage. Spitz tells us that many of these children came from socially well-adjusted, normal mothers whose only handicap was their inability to support themselves and their children. In many respects, the environments for the children in these 2 institutional settings was quite similar. In both, hygienic conditions were maintained. In both institutions, most of the children were breastfed early. The children were well nourished. Clothing was practically the same in both settings. The children in both institutions received good medical care, and so on. The 2 institutions, however, offered vastly different opportunities for interaction and relationship. The nursery in the institution for delinquent girls was run by a head nurse and her 3 assistants. Their duties consisted mainly of teaching the children's mothers in childcare and in supervising them. The children are fed, nursed and cared for by their own mothers, or in those cases where a mother is separated from her child for any reason, by the mother of another child, or by a pregnant girl who in this way acquires the necessary experience for the care of her own future baby. In the foundling home, there was a head nurse and 5 assistants and 45 babies, and the head nurse and 5 assistants provided all the care. Spitz observes that these nurses are unusually motherly, baby-loving women. But of course, the babies in the foundling home nevertheless lack all human contact for most of the day. They were condemned to solitary confinement in their cots. The table shows the mean developmental quotients of children in each of the 4 groups, averaged over the first 4 months and the last 4 months. At 3 to 4 months of age, the children in all 4 groups achieved developmental quotients in the normal range. At the end of the first year, little change was observed in the first 3 groups. On the whole, they were healthy and normal. The children in the foundling home, however, showed a significant decline of roughly 50 points on average. Spitz observes that apart from the severe developmental deprivation, the most striking single factor in the foundling home was the change in the pattern of the reaction to strangers in the last third of the first year. The usual behaviours were replaced by something that could vary from extreme friendliness to any human partner, combined with anxious avoidance of inanimate objects, to a generalised anxiety expressed in blood-curdling screams which would go on indefinitely. The children rarely vocalised, would turn away when approached. They rarely moved about their cots. Most had worn a valley in their mattresses and could not roll. Further, these children showed extreme susceptibility to infection. The problem in the nursery, and I have to share this with you, I just love the colourful language. Spitz says, the problem in the nursery was how to tame the healthy toddler's curiosity and enterprise. They climb up the bars of the cots after the manner of South Sea Islanders climbing palms. They vocalise freely, and some of them actually speak a word or two. All of them understand the significance of simple social gestures. When released from their cots, all walk with support and a number walk without it. What was the difference maker? Spitz says that it would take an exacting experimenter to invent an experiment with conditions as diametrically opposed in regard to the mother-child relationship as they are in these 2 institutions. Nursery provides each child with a mother to the nth degree, a mother who gives the child everything a good mother does, and beyond that, everything else she has. Having made this assessment, Spitz does, however, he's careful to point out that for the non-psychoanalytically oriented reader, we note that this intense mother-child relationship is not equivalent to a relationship based on love of the child. The psychoanalytically oriented reader, of course, realises that for these girls in prison, the child has become a hardly disguised phallic substitute. Such was the thinking of the day. So what can we take from these 2 experimental studies? I'm sure there's a number of messages that we can take. One obvious one seems to me to be about the interdependence of the biological and the social. Cozzolini suggested that the individual neuron or single human brain does not exist in nature. Without mutually stimulating interactions, people and neurons wither and die. We might also derive some other messages. One might be that children can thrive in the care of women and mothers with intellectual disability. Mothers with intellectual disability are quite capable of being the warm and responsive attachment figures that all children need. Another message is that with appropriate instruction and support, mothers with intellectual disability are capable of learning skills they need to care for and supervise their children. Of course, there's now a substantial body of research about parents and parenting with intellectual disability. There are studies that have looked at the parenting performance of parents with intellectual disability in the community, and there's quite a large number of parent training studies, including a randomised controlled trial that my team conducted to determine the efficacy of or to investigate the efficacy of a home-based and behaviour-based program called Healthy and Safe, which was designed to equip parents with knowledge and skills for making their home safer and for responding to child illness and injury in an appropriate way. The results of this and many other studies have confirmed well, they've confirmed some of those early observations that we might take from those 2 experimental studies. Today we understand that parents with intellectual disability comprise a diverse group with respect to parenting capacity, and their children are diverse also with respect to their developmental outcomes. You can find summaries of almost every study undertaken in this field on the Healthy Start website. Healthy Start is an Australian national strategy to build systems capacity to support these parents and their young children. It represents the culmination of 15 years of research, of our research in Australia. And you can find information about Healthy Start through the website or through these publications. I would just sum it up as 1 part knowledge translation and 1 part knowledge creation. I want to move on now to, or turn now to talk about intelligence and socioeconomic disadvantage, and in so doing, define perhaps a little more clearly the population I'm speaking about. There's evidence from a number of different sources that suggest that intelligence varies as a function of socioeconomic position. Of course, it may be the case that socioeconomic position varies as a function of intelligence, but actually the evidence for that relationship is much less compelling. But let me start by just clarifying my definition of intelligence here, or the definition I'm using here. Godfredson brought a group of 50 scientists together to define intelligence and to kind of review the state of knowledge at the time, and this is the definition they came up with. It's one that's frequently cited. Intelligence is a very general mental capability to reason, plan, solve problems, think abstractly, comprehend complex ideas, learn quickly, and learn from experience. It's catching on, making sense of things, or figuring out what to do. But back to the point, there's evidence from a number of different sources suggesting that intelligence varies as a function of socioeconomic position. I want to look at a little bit of that evidence. Firstly, I don't think there are any scholars who would argue the fact that intelligence runs in the family, so to speak. Heritability is the proportion of variability in a phenotype, in this case the IQ or intelligence, that is accounted for by mechanisms of inheritance, including but certainly not limited to gene sequence. Research has consistently found that heritability of intelligence varies as a function of socioeconomic position. Specifically, in socioeconomically advantaged families, inheritance explains most, if not all, of the observed variation. By contrast, in socioeconomically disadvantaged families, environment appears to play a much larger part. So what does this mean? One interpretation is that children living in poverty are less likely to develop their full genetic potential. Furthermore, the results suggest that there's a threshold effect for the influence of environment on intelligence. In other words, improving or enriching environments makes a positive difference, but only up to a point. And that interpretation is kind of consistent with findings from studies of enriched early childhood and preschool programs that fairly consistently show that children coming from fairly impoverished families benefit a great deal, but those coming from more advantaged families appear to benefit little from such programs. Another source of evidence comes from adoption studies. Together, these studies show that children from mostly low socioeconomic families who are adopted by higher socioeconomic parents typically score 12 to 18 points higher than comparison children, such as siblings or peers who stayed behind. Now, it's probably important to say that all or some of this effect may be due to a selection effect. That is, it's possible that some adopted children are selected for adoption because they are brighter or have social skills or better social skills than children not selected for adoption. In other words, adopted children may have higher intelligence to begin with, and that might explain at least part of this adoption effect. Now, if socioeconomic position is just a proxy for the level or type of stimulation or challenge afforded by different environments, then the so-called Flynn effect might also be interpreted in a way as evidence consistent with the proposition that intelligence varies as a function of socioeconomic position. The Flynn effect refers to large gains in IQ, generation upon generation, really since the time of industrialisation. There's some debate about the meaning or meaningfulness of these apparent gains in IQ, but most scholars seem convinced that the changes are real enough. A likely cause of the observed changes is the increasing complexity of the environment. In other words, it seems that as the adaptive challenges of everyday life have increased, we've collectively risen in IQ to meet these new adaptive demands. I think the implications of the Flynn effect are quite thought-provoking. Nessa, for example, points out that if children in 1932 took the 1997 test, the mean IQ would be about 80. 1/4 would be deficient. Vroon in the Netherlands observed that when scored against 1982 norms, Dutch men in 1952 would have had a mean IQ of 79. In 1918, Flynn observes, the mean IQ in the US would have been 75 if scored against today's norms. That means roughly half the population scored against today's norms might be classified as having intellectual disability. And it's intriguing to think that many parents with intellectual disability today would demonstrate normal intelligence if their performance was indexed to or referenced against the norms of yesteryear. There's also now a well-established relationship between intellectual disability and socioeconomic status. Children in families of lower socioeconomic position face increased risk of all forms of intellectual and developmental disability. And the evidence isn't meagre either. One study looked at over 5 million children in the UK between the ages of 7 and 12, and that was 98% of the population. And found that low family socioeconomic position is more strongly associated with mild, moderate intellectual disability compared to more severe forms. And by comparison with high family socioeconomic position, low family socioeconomic position increases the odds of mild, moderate intellectual disability by a factor greater than 4. That study also found that area level or community deprivation is associated with mild, moderate intellectual disability, but not more severe intellectual disability, even after controlling for household socioeconomic position. Taken together, the evidence suggests that when we're talking about people with intellectual disability, we may be talking about two distinct populations. There are those with more severe intellectual disability who tend to have other neurological conditions as well, or in association. And then there's that much larger population, population B here. And they're mostly adults with mild intellectual disability, much more strongly associated with socioeconomic disadvantage. It's often referred to as isolated intellectual disability. A key point here is that most parents with intellectual disability are drawn from that population B group, right? There's one more natural experiment I want to reflect on for a moment, the Swedish experiment. Between 1930 and 1980, there was a dramatic decrease in the prevalence of mild to moderate intellectual disability, but not severe intellectual disability. And that change was associated with an equally dramatic decrease in the number of children living in poverty improve maternal infant health care, and the implementation of community-based rehab programs for at-risk children, specifically prevention and early intervention, early preschool, childcare programs. Keeping in mind that most parents with intellectual disability have mild intellectual disability, the intriguing question to me, at least, is if we successfully eliminated poverty, effectively implemented community-based programs for kids at risk, including high-quality childcare and pre-K learning programs, would I have to develop a new area of research interest? Okay, I want to turn now to talk a little about parents with intellectual disability and you know, how diverse they are in relation to their parenting performance and child outcomes. And really starting to address this issue. In high-income countries, at least, parents with intellectual disability comprise a fairly homogenous group with respect to IQ. They have mostly mild intellectual disability. With respect to socioeconomic position, most are living on the margins, and also with respect to culture. Yet with respect to parenting performance, these parents comprise a heterogeneous group. The question is, how can we account for this? This involves some conceptual or theoretical thinking. This is a rather simplistic kind of interactional model, but I think it's sufficient for my purposes today. The model shows a number of well-established linkages. We understand that biology and experience are coactive in shaping a child's development. We understand that children are coactive in shaping their own environments. There's that bidirectional relationship between parenting and or parenting behaviours and child functioning. But I want to focus my attention on this link between social relationships, parenting capacity and parenting behaviours. But I also want to preface what I have to say with a couple of observations. The first is that we can think of parenting capacity as a parent's parenting capacity to provide for the needs of the developing child. That is, we can think of parenting capacity as a property of a specified individual. This is kind of how parenting capacity is represented in this model. Alternatively, we can think of parenting capacity as a property of the child's social ecology. Thinking about parenting capacity in that way, I think recognises that many people may be involved in parenting the child. That is, if parenting is defined as the task of meeting a child's needs for preservation, nurturance and socialisation, when we think about parenting, we tend to think about the things that parents do. If we take a child-focused definition, parenting is meeting the child's needs for preservation, nurturance and socialisation, then I think we're in a better position to appreciate that many are involved. The second point I would make here is that a parent's parenting capacity, or rather a parent's capacity to perform the parenting role, depends on how that role is scripted or defined within a particular cultural community. That is, on cultural expectation. A parent's capacity could conceivably be sufficient in one cultural context, but quite inadequate in another. Culture also indirectly affects a parent's parenting capacity by way of experience. A parent's experience may be shaped by any number of factors, including their own characteristics, gender, ethnicity, disability, and so on. But how such characteristics influence their experience depends on the culture in which they live. For example, in a culture where intellectual disability is stigmatising, and where people with intellectual disability are devalued, a person with intellectual disability is more likely to experience harassment, bullying, sexual assault, and so on. You'll recall that in our child protection sample, we found that mothers with intellectual disability were far more likely to have been exposed to maltreatment in their own upbringing. That's a fairly robust research finding. But before I go on, I want to think a little bit about what parenting capacity means. And I might just consult you on that a little bit. I'm interested in your ideas about what constitutes parenting capacity, what goes into it. So I wonder if I might just invite the thoughts of those people in the room here. What sorts of things make up parenting capacity?
I believe that one of the elements, the way you frame capacity, would be the parent's ability to understand their community, understand areas of their community where they can engage themselves and have their child exposed and engaged to other community members, other children, and experience a meaningful life in regard to exposure of that community. So part of the capacity would be knowing how to connect themselves and their child to parts of the community.
Mm-hmm.
Would be one aspect of parent capacity, the way that I'm hearing you frame it.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
I also think parent capacity would include the ability, the availability of resources that the parent can use to support children or a child.
Sure.
And the ability also to navigate the systems that would enable the parent to access resources out there that could help him or her in the process.
Yes.
I would also think it has to do with the parent's ability to recognize their need for support and the fact that they're willing to accept the supports. That's what our experience has been, is that that's the number one driver in order for success, is that recognition.
Yes.
Of support.
I would add that the parenting capacity strengths we see are in that ability to respond, understand and respond to ages and stages of baby and child development.
Yes. Great. Okay. Yes.
So sorry, webcast viewers. Didn't know that was going to happen. Eileen said, would a diagnosis such as FASD affect parenting capacity?
That's a question? Okay. Potentially. I think the answer is almost always it depends. So after that rather limp answer, I'll move on. Look, it probably surprised you to see me define it in this way. I certainly don't think that parenting capacity, this is all there is to it, but I think these are important cognitive affective components, if you like. That is, when we're defining parenting capacity as a parent's parenting capacity. So we can think, for example, of parenting IQ. Parenting IQ is not the same as IQ per se, but it does have that component of fluid intelligence, if you like, the reasoning, problem-solving, learning and planning, and the crystallised component of intelligence, if you like, which is the acquired parenting-related knowledge and skills, where I think we focus a great deal of attention. And I think that other components I've included here is the a capacity for self-regulation, kind of modulating our emotions and motivation, being able to filter out noise and distraction so that we can stay focused on the task at hand, impulse control. And then there's this fascinating concept of mind sight, which I'm going to come to in just a moment. Okay, mind sight. Although our understanding is still quite limited, apparently we come equipped with a neurological gear to sync up with others at a subconscious level. With a neurological gear that enables us to take another's perspective, to predict another's intention, to empathise with them, to close the loop between minds. Now, it seems quite likely that this ability is important for that warm and responsive caregiving and the development of that strong and reciprocal parent-child bond, which seems to be all important for a young child's early brain development. An important point I want to make here is that parents with intellectual disability vary not only in their parenting IQ. A number of studies have found that IQ is only weakly associated with measures of self-regulation or executive function. Further, parents with intellectual disability may have excellent mind sight. And the thought that comes to mind is many years ago, I worked with Robert Strike, a father with intellectual disability and a self-advocate. We worked on a paper together. I was really just the scribe. The paper was titled, "Look at me, listen to me, I have something important to say." Well, one of the important things that Robert had to say was people with intellectual disability, at least many of them, have antennas for If that's not a good indicator of mind sight, I'm not sure what is. Another key point I want to make here is that recent neuroscientific studies have produced evidence suggesting that our ability for mind sight or mentalising is associated with the size of our social network, who we know. So this is one way in which social relationships may directly affect a parent's parenting capacity. There are a number of studies that support or provide evidence that supports some of the links that were shown in that model. For example, in a recent study utilising that data from the Canadian Incident Study of Reported Child Abuse and Neglect, we found evidence consistent with a causal chain running from low maternal social support through maternal mental health issues and in turn alleged emotional maltreatment to emotional behavioural issues in the child. I could review a number of studies which basically say the same thing, but there wouldn't be a lot of fun in that. So I want to branch out a little and talk about other research that highlights the significance of social relationships. One is this Framingham Heart Study. Some of you may be familiar with it. It involved a longitudinal study, 20 years, looking at the social networks and looking at happiness in a sample of nearly 5,000 individuals. The key findings were that people who are at the centre of social networks tend to be happier. People who socially interact with happy people are more likely to become happy in the future. And the real kicker, the spread of happiness seems to reach up to 3 degrees of separation. That means our happiness, or an upturn in our own happiness, can affect our friends' happiness. So it seems our emotional or affective state are not merely self-regulated, they're socially regulated. And there are other studies that that present evidence to this effect as well. So this would seem to be another mechanism connecting social interactions or social relationships to a parent's parenting capacity. Now, from happiness to death, a meta-analytic review study showed that basically, having positive social relationships, being well connected, was as potent in terms of effect as quitting smoking. Right? It reduces or increases the rate of survival or reduces the risk of mortality, to about the same measure as quitting smoking. I think that's quite fascinating, really. So social integration exerts an independent influence on risk of mortality comparable with smoking cessation. Don't worry about the figure there, it's really there for art, not information. So again, it seems that Cozzolini was right. The individual neuron or single human brain does not exist in nature. Without mutually stimulating interactions, people and neurons wither and die. Staying on the theme of mortality, My team recently conducted a secondary analysis of a large population data set here in Canada. We're interested in looking at suicidal ideation, or the relationship between disability and suicidal ideation. We found that adults with disabilities are six times, we found that the odds of suicidal ideation in the prior 12 months was 6 times greater for adults with disabilities than for adults without disability, 6 times greater. However, we found that this increased risk of suicidal ideation was largely explained by, firstly, the higher prevalence of psychiatric morbidity in this population, but also by food insecurity and sense of community belonging. The odds drop from 6.2 to 2.8, so the risk is attenuated by more than half. So again, another good indicator about just how important social connection, community belonging, and the social conditions of our lives are. And of course, also with the vulnerability of people with disabilities. There are many potential mechanisms, many potential pathways linking social relationships to parenting capacity and health. I want to mention just 4. One is the stress buffering hypothesis. Another is the social exclusion literally hurts hypothesis. Now, if you plug that into a Google search, it's not going to turn up much. It's kind of my version of a hypothesis that really comes from social pain theory. I'll talk a little about it in a moment. Then there's the social learning or social regulation hypothesis and the psychological or intrinsic rewards hypothesis. The stress buffering hypothesis is straightforward. Put simply, life events are stressful to the extent that people appraise the events as threats, primary appraisal, and perceive themselves as lacking adequate coping resources, secondary appraisal. Social support's a coping resource, and when people have it, they're less likely to perceive life events as threats, and they're more likely to have confidence in their ability to cope. Now, although perhaps the most popular hypothesis, or the most frequently tested one, there's not a great deal of support for this hypothesis. Even in our own studies, we've tested this hypothesis on a number of occasions. We've looked, for example, at whether the effect of child behaviour problems or the effect of severe financial hardship would vary depending on the strength of one's social network or perceived social support. And we find very little in terms of a moderating effect. What we have found consistently is quite a powerful direct effect. So it seems that for our well-being, our level of social integration and social support is critical for our well-being, irrespective of the stresses we face. The social exclusion hurts hypothesis. Well, there's some really interesting research that shows that human beings physiologically respond to social exclusion in much the same way as they respond to physical pain or danger. And of course, when our physiological threat defence system is activated and the limbic system is flooding the prefrontal cortex with, here's my nerdy Lost in Space reference, danger, Will Robertson, danger, our ability to modulate our emotions and control our impulses may be overwhelmed. And when our threat defence system is kind of chronically active, this can have long-term detrimental effects on our immune system functioning, on neural connectivity, and of course behaviour. The social learning or regulation hypothesis has these components. Of course, it's through social interactions that we learn what is normal or respectable behaviour, for example, what it takes to be a mum within our cultural community. And this knowledge guides our interactions. And then there's that aspect of social regulation. You know, the mere presence of others may cue conformity with social norms. This is sometimes called the audience effect. You know, we change our behaviour, we're actually much nicer, much more generous and empathetic and so on when we know we're being observed. And of course, social network members may directly intervene, monitoring, encouraging, persuading, reminding, and even pressuring us to you know, behave in a different way. And lastly, the psychological rewards hypothesis. You know, the idea here is that our membership of groups can create in us a sense of belonging and security. Another idea is that mattering to others gives our lives purpose and significance. And a third idea is that successful performances of socially valued roles, and that could be as simple as comforting a baby who has gas pain, such successful performances engenders a general sense of control or mastery over life. So there are potentially many mechanisms. And finally, to wrap up, I just want to say a few words about this new program. I'm getting the nod saying it's okay, you don't need to rush. I appreciate that, thank you. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the supported learning program. But before I do, a little history. The first study I ever did in this field, back in 1993, 1994, it took me all around my home state of New South Wales, Australia, driving around, visiting, hanging out with mums and dads with intellectual disability. I had to travel out to farms, open 20 gates before I got to the front door. It was actually a great experience. The focus of the study, we talked to the professionals involved in these parents' lives as well. We asked them what their support and service needs were, and both the professionals and the parents talked about their desire, or the need and desire to learn and improve their parenting skills. You know, they recognise that need. But what the parents also said, which the professionals did not comment or acknowledge or perceive at all, is the parents really emphasised or wanted help with meeting people and making friends and accessing community resources. So that first study led to a whole series of studies where we explored the social networks, social support around parents with intellectual disability, studies that found, you know, or established in this group a strong connection between the level of social support and psychological well-being of these families, and you know, and to linking to outcomes for children too. But all that train of research ultimately led to the development of the supported learning program. Now, if you look at the literature, there are a number of different approaches are described to strengthening social relationships. One is enhancing existing social support. So an example of that would be the Circles of Support program. Another is the provision of compensatory support. An example of that would be volunteer home visiting. And then there's an adult learning approach, which is where the supported learning program really fits in. The supported learning program, it has these components. It's essentially a group work, a 10 to 12 week group work program with, and this kind of supplemental individual support over that time. It's not, we never envisaged that this program would be the be-all and end-all. It was only ever imagined to be a step on the ladder to expanding one's social network, to plugging into community, to participating more, ultimately to reducing social isolation and improving mental health. So the SLP is certainly not another parent training program. In fact, there's no curriculum of skills to be learned. There's no information to be imparted by an expert. It's much more like a group project, a group research project, as a matter of fact. The mothers involved draw upon their own experience. That's the data. That's the research data. And through a facilitated process, the mums together create new knowledge and awareness that they can use to overcome obstacles, to broaden their social networks, to plug into the community and work towards achieving their own goals. The development of the program was a collaborative process. We brought some very experienced practitioners together in the first instance to kind of conceptualise. Then we brought a group of frontline practitioners together who were keen to actually pilot the program, and they really put meat on the bones of this program. Those practitioners then piloted it with groups of mothers, and then we went to those mums and asked them, how can we make this program work better? With their input, we revised that program, and we trialled the program again. This is our first logic model. This is what it looked like. Basically, the program would empower, increase confidence and critical awareness. That would lead to increased social integration and participation, increased perceived social support, which would lead to a decrease in depression, anxiety and stress, and ultimately increased positive mother-child interactions. The model's a little more complicated than that today, although it might not need to be. So to facilitate that process, that research project, the supported learning program uses three main devices. In the first instance, the mothers create a mural of their community. This usually involves actually getting out into the community to discover what's there in terms of resources and opportunities. The mural is then used to facilitate discussion. So the mums come in and with photos of themselves, they place it on the mural and talk about places in the community where they perhaps feel uncomfortable and other places where they feel less threatened. A second component is that three-step questioning strategy, where we firstly invite the mums to share their experiences. Maybe it was the experience of attending a playgroup or of trying to enrol their child in a preschool program. We ask them to describe their experiences, invite them to then reflect on that experience, to understand a bit about, or to reflect on, what was going on in that situation. And the third piece is thinking about, that's the problem-solving piece. And the third main device is this stepping stones activity. It's a task analysis approach. It's what are your goals? How are you going to get there? Let's break that down into achievable, doable steps. The mums would then implement those strategies that they had together developed, come back to the group, and that cycle of reflection and problem solving would begin again. Throughout the program, mums receive individual support to get out and about in their community, to work on their individual goals. In terms of outcomes, the pilot was a simple pre-post evaluation. There were 6 groups, 42 mums involved in all. There were groups in communities, rural and city-based communities in 2 different states in Australia. What we found was really encouraging. The measured effects of the supported learning program, particularly on depression and perceived social support, far exceeded established benchmarks for parent training and family support programs. And these findings, as they say, proof is in the pudding, really. So the findings were really reinforced by a very high level of personal and program goal attainment. We used personal goal attainment or goal attainment scaling, as well as some well-validated measures of depression, anxiety and stress, and sense of control and mastery. But the proof is in the pudding, and many of the participants by the end of the program were actually getting out and about. They felt more confident. They were volunteering, enrolling in courses, joining other groups, and so on. There were a few mums who dropped out of the program midway, and we investigated why. And in every single instance, it was because the mum had joined an interest group in the community, enrolled in something that clashed with the time. So we were quite satisfied. So the results are really encouraging, and I'm not really at liberty we're currently piloting this program in Alberta. Several sites have completed, and again, the results are really encouraging. And so, you know, the results of that, of the Alberta pilot, should be, you know, available soon. Now, I am sure that I am out of time, and I'd like to now invite any questions.
I'm pleased that I actually have a couple of questions from the webcast. SP asked if social support or social inclusion strongly affects the well-being of these with intellectual disabilities. What would be the single most important change that we as a community can make?
The single most important change that we as a community can make. Wow, that's a big question. You know what? Given 5 minutes, I'd probably answer the question in a different way, but what I want to do is kind of close the loop in this talk and go back to what I said in my opening remarks, and that is we need to really value, I think, the function of community-based agencies as bridges, connecting people together and connecting them to the community. I think there's good evidence that the terminology is a little different, but I think there's widespread recognition that there's a significant decline in social capital in our society, a significant decline in our levels of social trust. This, to me, perhaps represents the single biggest threat to child wellbeing there is. So I think we need to of course, results-based, outcome-oriented, hard measurable outcomes, all that stuff, very important. Implementing evidence-based programs, such as the P positive parenting program, again, all very important, but I think all of that has to be grafted to the vine, and the vine is that essential role of bridging people, of connecting people to community. So I see that as being, you know, really, really key.
Does the SLP group involve parents without developmental disabilities?
You know, to date, the program, in Australia, the trial involved almost exclusively parents with intellectual disability. Some of those parents may have had FASD. Interestingly, here in Alberta, the majority of the participants so far are mums with FASD, but most of whom also having you know, mild intellectual disability. So it's quite interesting. One of the other questions I get is what about fathers? Is this a program for fathers? Well, potentially could be. But the focus at this point, in this early stage of development really, has been on mothers. I think there are good reasons for you know, women coming together without men being there, and there's good reasons for men to get together without women being there, and there's probably other, you know, times and issues around which we will want to bring them together, but that's kind of for the future.
Are supports provided for grief and loss or trauma before beginning the program with the individual participants?
Okay, that is an excellent question. I was having this discussion with some colleagues earlier. We learned very early, back in the early 1990s when we were trialling the Healthy and Safe program, that unless we were fully present, like, it would have been easy for us to go in with our agenda. I think it is easy for us as parent educators or professionals to go in with our agenda. But we learned quickly that we needed to be fully present, meaning that we needed to start from where the parent was at. That meant that we'd often have to do a little bit of troubleshooting, connect mum and mum or dad up with other kinds of supports, including grief counselling. One thing to think about is, one concern that I have is so many of these mums have children taken from their care, yet I'm aware of just one program in all the world that offers kind of a grief counselling process for mums after their children have been taken away. A program in Sweden, which I think is an absolute model program and should be replicated everywhere. And I think it's absolutely critical. It's critical, because unless that grief and loss is dealt with, a lot of these families will just go on to have more and more children. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but the reason for it is not necessarily a good thing. Seeking replacement, not necessarily a good motivation, right? But, so I think the provision of grief and loss in that context, I think there's a great need for that. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I have a lot of questions here. Is healthy touch and hugging encouraged as well as physical activity and music?
At my home, it certainly is. I'm not sure what the context is for the question.
I think this is in the SLP.
In the supported learning program?
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, I guess let me repeat. It's not a program designed to assist or help mums interact in even more positive ways with their children. It's a program for mums who are all too often very isolated in their community, and who all too often experience very high levels of stress, anxiety and depression. So it's a program designed to connect those mums into the community, to broaden their social networks, to increase their perceived level of social support, and in so doing reduce their level of depression, anxiety and stress, and also create other opportunities for them to learn from others in many informal settings. Right, so it's kind of, I hope that answers the question.
No, but you seem to have piqued a lot of interest in the SLP. So my next question is, where are the pilot locations in Alberta? How many families and parents are participating? And the other question was, will it be more broadly implemented throughout Alberta? And if yes, how do we get it in our community?
We would welcome any interest right now of people who would be interested in participating in this pilot and trial of the SLP program here in Alberta. One thing we could do is connect you up with some practitioners who have already used the program here, and they can share their experience, which has actually been overwhelmingly positive. I'm more enthusiastic than ever about this rather simple kind of a program. It seems to me that community-based workers really get it in a way that they don't always get behaviour-based training programs. There seems to be a nice fit. So the program seems to be welcomed by community-based workers. So the response has been, very positive. There have been sites who have really struggled. Their wheels have really spun. They've struggled to bring a group together. So where it seems to have gone easiest is where there was an already established group of mums, and they would take it on. But there were other groups, other practitioners who tried to bring mums together and really struggled. So, we're not saying this is an easy thing to do.
But do they contact you?
They can contact me. They can email me at the University of...
It's okay. I actually have all of the resources built on a page already that will be emailed out to everyone who is watching the webcast right now.
But please contact us. We'd really welcome your participation. We think it's potentially a really useful and helpful resource, not a standalone resource. other kinds of supports parents may need. And it's not, for example, a program for that mum with intellectual disability who's really well connected. And I can tell you, I've got to know 300-400 families headed by parents with intellectual disability over the last 20 years. I know a lot of mums who are much more sociable than I am, who have much stronger social networks than I do. You know, it's a program for those who are, you know, somewhat disconnected or socially isolated, right?
Finally, and I don't know if you're the right person to ask this question, but can parents with intellectual disabilities benefit from Triple P?
You know what? I've recently worked with a group in Belgium who, well, I helped them write their work up so that it could be published in an English journal. That was the full extent of my contribution. They adapted the Triple P program for parents with intellectual disability, and they got really good results. You know, there's this question, do we develop special programs for these special populations? I don't think that's really the way to go. My feeling is we're much better off thinking about what are the universal programs out there, what are the mainstream programs out there, how do we adapt those so that they are in fact accessible too? Because I think that's the only way we can ensure that there's truly equal opportunity. So that's kind of my bit.
Are there any questions in the room? All right then.
Thank you so much.